They were everywhere. As Mario and Luigi continued to dominate the video game world and pop culture, the Nintendo Entertainment System successfully changed the video game world forever. But the two brothers were not alone. As we cross the midway point of the 80s, the Sega Master System also throws its hat in the ring to compete with the NES. Besides these two, the world of home computing also presented another option for video games, notably through the Commodore 64. For those who had yet to adopt the new systems, the Atari 2600 could still be found in basements everywhere, alongside shoeboxes full of cartridges. In the second half of the decade, the world of video games seemed better than ever. But there was something new on the horizon, something that was a step ahead of all of these systems, something that was quite ahead of its time. I'm Jamie Logie, and this is Everything 80s, a podcast that looks back on a decade that forever changed the way we dress, consume, and connected. And today we go back to 1987 to witness the release of one of the most advanced video game systems we had ever seen. It was the first console of the fourth generation, the first 16-bit system. This is the history of the TurboGrafx-16. If you were a video game lover in the second half of the 80s, you probably remember the TurboGrafx-16 being at the elite level of gaming. As we crossed the midway point of the decade, it seemed as if video games had peaked. But the TurboGrafx-16 turned everything on its head, and it ushered in a whole new era of gaming. But before we get to that, we need to set the stage. As we come out of the early 1980s, Atari ruled the roost when it came to the home video game market. For them, it was a multi-billion-dollar market. But as we go into 1983, something happens. Since there were no limitations on who could make cartridges for the Atari 2600, a lot of inferior third-party games flooded the market. Games that were so bad that they quickly destroyed consumers' confidence in the system. This seemed to all come to a head with the release of the E.T. Atari video game at the end of 1982.
Video game that lets you help E.T. get home.
It's not the worst game of all time, but possibly the most disappointing. The poorly received game was returned in droves, and gamers had had enough of the endless amount of lackluster cartridges. Poor quality games, an overproduction of consoles, an economic recession, and competition from the home computer resulted in the great video game crash of 1983. For Atari, their $3+ billion market share dropped to just around $100 million in less than 2 years. It seemed as if it was game over for much of the video game industry. But in 1985, a 100-year-old Japanese company resurrected the industry in North America. The company that started out making playing cards eventually moved into electronic games. In the early 80s, they released the Family Computer or Famicom in Japan. That system was a huge hit, and even though it was a risk to launch in the decimated North American video game landscape, they did, but with a new design and a new name, the Nintendo Entertainment System. Built off the back of massively successful games like Super Mario Bros. And Duck Hunt, the video game industry was rejuvenated. In 1986 came the release of another 8-bit console, the Sega Master System. Interestingly, the Sega Master System came out in Japan around the same time as the Famicom, but this is when Sega was known as the SG-1000. That eventually turned into the Mark III and then became the Master System. Sega was still a few years away from their flagship character Sonic the Hedgehog, but with games like Space Harrier, the Wonder Boy games, R-Type, and Sega's response to Mario at the time, Alex Kidd in the Miracle World, Sega proved to be competition. Sega and NES, though, weren't the only games in town, but they were the big players, and were instrumental in what's considered the third generation of video games, the 8-bit generation. By 1986, the video game market had fully recovered from the crash of '83. VideoGameSales.com has worldwide console revenue at $4.5 billion. Adjusted for inflation, that's nearly $13 billion. In 1986, sales of Mario Brothers alone hit the $250 million mark. Today, that's about $750 million. Things had gotten so big that a culture war of sorts emerged. For many kids, the question was, what side did you fall on? Were you Team Sega or Team NES? But as great as the NES and Master System were, there were still some limitations on gameplay, graphics, and sound. A game like Outrun for the Sega Master System was one of those games that looked like a step above many other ones. With its pseudo 3D-like graphics, the car racing game almost felt like arcade quality in your own living room. The systems had taken the 8-bit technology to incredible levels, but there was a ceiling on 8-bit cartridges and consoles. Was there room for something bigger and better? Was a 16-bit system possible? With the launch of the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis, we, of course, know it was possible. But before those, another system beat them both to the 16-bit punch. It began in Japan as the PC Engine, a console created by Japanese electronic giant NEC. This is a company that began back in the late 1800s. NEC began in telephones and communications, but eventually, over the decades, moved into computers. As we enter the 1980s, NEC released a series of 8-bit computers and products like the NEC APC microcomputer. By the mid-80s, Nintendo had shown the world how big video games could really be, and how lucrative the industry was too. A 2013 Guardian article shares how NEC wanted to compete with the Nintendo Famicom. NEC had already released a 16-bit PC, and had become the leader in the Japanese PC industry. And now, crossing the midway point of the 80s, NEC wants a piece of the video game action. And they believe they can make a splash with their more advanced computing. The Famicom was the dominant system in Japan and the dominant system in North America as the NES. But NEC saw the Famicom as lackluster and not all that powerful. Video games, they believed, could be even better. This led to a collaboration with Hudson Soft, a video game company that goes back to the 1970s. Hudson Soft was involved in creating computer products before moving into video games. According to NintendoFandom.com, Hudson Soft was even a third-party publisher for Nintendo, creating games like Bomberman, Adventure Island, and Mario Party. According to the article Stalled Engine by Christian Nutt, a former blog director for Gamasutra, Hudson Soft even thought they could design Nintendo's next console. But Nintendo wasn't interested. Hudson Soft wasn't a big enough company to manufacture their own video game console, and even approached Sega about a partnership. But this is where NEC enters the picture. with a partnership, maybe NEC and Hudson Soft could take on Sega and Nintendo with something that looked better, played better, and sounded better. Hudson would design it, NEC would manufacture and market it. Between the two of them, maybe they could create something that would leave Mario in their dust. But could having two big companies involved in one product create some problems? We'll get back to that in a bit. What the two companies came up with was a video game system called the PC Engine. Released in Japan in October 1987, the fact that a 16-bit system was already on the market was pretty astonishing. It had barely been 4 years since the Famicom was released in Japan, and barely 2 years since the launch of the NES in North America. It had only been a year since the Sega Master System hit North America, and here we had a new console with better graphics, sound, and gameplay. The 16-bit revolution and the fourth generation of video games was already underway. The design of the PC Engine was quite sleek. It looked like something from the future, but it was now officially on the market. And in Japan, it caught on pretty quickly. According to The Guardian, the PC Engine quickly outsold the Famicom, an astonishing achievement. But like the Famicom and Mark III, this new PC Engine needed to launch in North America. With all the advancements that came from the 16-bit technology, the PC Engine seemed like it would be a can't miss in North America. But like its competition, the PC Engine needed to come with a new name and a new marketing approach for North American consumers, and then to other parts of the world. The US branch of NEC Japan put together a launch team, including a few people from Atari, to get the PC Engine on the North American market. They started by focus testing the system and the games with some American consumers. The initial response was very positive. The games were a lot faster than NES or Sega games, and the 16-bit graphics shined through. But test consumers weren't too sure about the name, or even the look of the console. The PC Engine was so advanced that the casing itself was quite small. The light gray console looked like kind of a slim projector or a futuristic card reader from a movie like Blade Runner. The technology and internals had shrunk so much that the machine looked minuscule to some of the focus group members. Even though it would become a big issue, at the time, the demand for a new look wasn't necessarily all that concerning. The NES, for example, looked night and day different compared to the Famicom, and that was by design. After the video game crash of 1983, a top-loading console like the Atari needed to be a thing of the past, as was the verbiage associated with it. The NES was not a video game console, it was an entertainment system. And instead of loading a cartridge on top, the game pack slid in the front of the control deck, just like a VHS tape, into a VCR. This new design feature further illustrated the point that this was a device for entertainment. The TurboGrafx-16 didn't use big game packs, but unique, slim turbo chip game cards about the size of a credit card. Definitely a futuristic design. But there was still that issue with the console itself. According to Christian Nutt, the thought was that American consumers wanted something bigger and even more futuristic than what they were seeing with the PC Engine console design. The entire casing of the PC Engine would be given an overhaul. What they eventually came up with was a larger, and wider black console. It looked more like a heavy-duty Star Wars-like video game system. It looks like what Darth Vader would play video games on when he wasn't force choking everything in sight. Then there was the name. What was a PC Engine? Was this system more a computer than a video game? It sounded like the internals of an IBM PC more than something to have fun with. But there was one interesting word associated with the PC Engine. A word that was more of a description of the system's speed and prominence of its visuals. That word? TurboGrafx. By adding the 16 from 16-bit to the descriptive name and putting an X on the end of graphics, the TurboGrafx-16 was born. These were going to be some big changes. The name is one thing, but a full redesign of the console was going to take time. And Nintendo continues to run away with the video game market, with Sega not far behind them. There was another concern. It probably wouldn't be long until the two companies came up with a North American 16-bit system of their own. NEC and Hudson Soft needed to get this thing into the North American market. And this is where some of the problems began. NEC had a specific idea for how the new TurboGrafx-16 should look, but Hudson didn't share the same enthusiasm. Advanced technology, gameplay, and sound design may be limited without a great game or character to define that system. After watching the rise of the Nintendo Entertainment System, we learned how important a flagship character was for the success of a console. Nintendo had Mario, and this was followed by the success of Sonic the Hedgehog for Sega. The TurboGrafx-16 had Keith Courage. Even though they had considered a Mario-like game called Kato and Ken, Keith Courage in Alpha Zones was the game included with the TurboGrafx-16. This action-adventure platform game was a game created by Hudson Soft for the PC Engine, but would hopefully help launch the TurboGrafx-16 in North America. But now another issue. This game didn't exactly show all the advanced features and technological capabilities of the TurboGrafx. Was this going to be an issue? The delays in the console redesign pushed the release of the TurboGrafx-16 North American launch later than expected, right into the summer of 1989. But eventually, the new 16-bit system finally launched in August 1989.
TurboGrafx-16 from NEC. A higher energy video game system.
The emphasis in the marketing was centered around the word turbo. TurboGrafx, Turbo Sound, and Turbo Action. This new system was everything we loved about video games, only ramped up to the extreme. The tagline even told us that this was the higher energy video game system. But the next problem, it wasn't cheap. The TurboGrafx-16, with just one controller, mind you, would set you back anywhere from $189 to $199. In today's money, that's around $500. Not exactly the cheapest thing. Speaking of the controller, there was a reason why it only came with one. I'll get back to that in a moment. The delayed release of the TurboGrafx-16 presented a massive problem because if you know your video game history, you know what else came out at the exact same time during the summer of 1989.
And so it was. He brought forth Genesis, a system with twice the power, twice the intelligence, twice the challenge, twice the fun.
The Sega Genesis was also released in the summer of 1989. This was obviously concerning. But TurboGrafx had a specific marketing approach. They looked to target older teenagers and even adults who wanted a serious and more mature gaming machine. The TurboGrafx-16 wasn't a kid's toy, but intended for the serious gamer. One of the early ads even featured a woman in all black leather, essentially indicating this thing wasn't for kids. TurboGrafx was like the Jolt Cola of video game consoles. The TurboGrafx-16 was then launched in Europe in late 1989, but depending where you're listening from, you may remember it under its original Japanese name, the PC Engine. Some of the first games released for the TurboGrafx-16 included Blazing Lasers, Alien Crush, The Legendary Axe, Dragon Spirit, Dungeon Explorer, and Fantasy Zone. Not long after, there was Bonk's Adventure, a game based around a small cave boy with a huge head. Bonk's Adventure was a well-received game, and the character seems as if it could have been their Mario. But the game itself didn't even come out in Japan until months after the system was released in North America. The games that were available at launch time, however, were indeed the next level of gaming. They did feature remarkable graphics, fast action, and some of the most incredible sound design ever heard in a video game. A big feature of the TurboGrafx-16 was its ability to be expanded. This included one add-on feature that no other home video game system up to that point had done yet: the TurboTap. The TurboTap accessory was a plug-in adapter of sorts that allowed 5 controllers to connect to the console. I mentioned earlier how the original console only came with one controller, and that's because it only had one controller plug-in port. Yes, the TurboTap was another expense, but significantly expanded the usability of the system. The TurboGrafx-16 was capable of being a true social video game system, allowing for multi-person gaming. This just wasn't possible with an Atari, NES, or Sega Master System. Speaking of accessories, you could also get the Turbo Stick, a larger control pad with a similar joystick to that of an arcade game, creating yet another unique in-home gaming experience. TurboGrafx also emphasized the advanced technology that the competitors didn't have. Back in 1988 in Japan, the PC Engine, as it was then, could be paired with a CD-ROM to further enhance gameplay and sound. Then, just a few months after the release of the TurboGrafx-16 in North America, came the TurboGrafx CD.
And you can expand your system with a CD player for CD games with sound effects that are turbocharged.
This much bigger console made use of CD technology, the very first console to do so. The larger amount of storage from CDs allowed for a unique new era of video game features such as real voice acting and cinematic cutscenes, things that are now pretty standard in the video game world today. But again, the TurboGrafx CD didn't come cheap, as it retailed for $400 or over $1,000 in today's money. And it didn't even come with any games. Speaking of games, the average TurboGrafx game went for about $50, or around $125 in today's money. The launch of the Sega Genesis ultimately presented a huge problem for NEC and the TurboGrafx-16, as they just couldn't compete with the marketing budgets of both Sega and Nintendo. But NEC still ran a grassroots promotion of sorts. Depending on where you live, you may remember your mall featuring a huge TurboGrafx-16 promotion, and a setup that featured a massive pyramid of TVs and speakers blasting the song Pure Energy by Information Society. This was the perfect song to connect to the tagline, the higher energy video game system. In the malls, NEC ran contests and tournaments for prizes. Much to my very vocal chagrin when I was younger, I never owned a TurboGrafx-16, but I have a listener who did. Paul, who comes from my old stomping grounds of Connecticut. Not only did he end up owning the legendary system, but before that, he got to attend one of these live promotional events at his mall, where his friend won second place in a Blazing Lasers video game tournament. The second place prize? A TurboGrafx-16. Another way NEC promoted the TurboGrafx was through a promotional VHS tape.
You are about to witness the future in video game entertainment. The TurboGrafx-16 Entertainment Super System. 16-bit power.
Unfortunately for the TurboGrafx-16, the downfall quickly came. The highly advanced TurboGrafx CD was out of the price range of many people. The basic console wasn't exactly cheap either. And when you compare it to the other consoles at the time, it was a tough price to justify, especially for parents who had already shelled out for an expensive video game system that they believed would serve their kids for decades. Example, the year before the TurboGrafx came out, you could get the NES action set that came with the control deck, 2 controllers, the NES Zapper, and the Mario Bros. Duck Hunt Dual Game Pack for just $109.99. This is still a significant purchase, but quite a good value, and nearly $100 cheaper than a TurboGrafx-16. If you were saving up your own money, the sales figures reveal that you were probably going to get an NES. But a Sega Master System was also a viable alternative. For parents who had already been begged for an Atari, then an NES or a Sega, maybe a Commodore 64, and now the Sega Genesis, yet another new video game system was just too much. Especially for someone like my dad, who didn't even think there was a difference between Atari and Nintendo. He also thought video games peaked with Pong, but that's a whole other story. And then yet another problem. According to Christian Nutt, in Japan, third-party companies were still making games for the PC Engine, but NEC couldn't attract publishers in the West. Ultimately, initial sales of the TurboGrafx-16 were disappointing. But the retail price and the competition were just part of the issue for the TurboGrafx. Without the extensive advertising budget of Nintendo or Sega, it was harder to make a dent in the market. Did having just one controller and one controller port doom the console? Did they underestimate how many kids wanted two-player games, and how the Turbo Tap add-on may have just been too expensive after the system itself already cost a small fortune? Was the delay in redesigning the console case time they couldn't afford, which unfortunately put their release right alongside the Sega Genesis? Would being able to launch with Bonk's Adventure and the Bonk character have made a more significant impact at release time? Would Bonk have been the perfect character to tie in with the TurboGrafx-16 when they started promoting the system earlier in 1989? And with rumblings of a new 16-bit Nintendo system on the horizon, was it just too late for the TurboGrafx-16 to make a significant impact in North America? Despite big expectations at first by NEC, ultimately the TurboGrafx-16 just couldn't hang on. For many kids in the 80s, the Sega Genesis was their first introduction to 16-bit video gaming. because as the tagline went, Genesis does what Nintendo don't. For many, the Genesis seemed like the original 16-bit system. The Mega Drive, as it was first known in Japan, came out in October 1988. But the PC engine that became the TurboGrafx-16 still predates it by a year. That was quite a significant amount of time in the fast-paced video game world of the 1980s. The TurboGrafx-16 remains revolutionary in the history of video games. Not only was it the first console to use a 16-bit graphic processor, even though technically the CPU was 8-bit, but it showed us how good a video game could look and sound. It made use of the CD-ROM add-on, which, along with more complex video and audio, made games more dynamic and immersing. And this helped influence future consoles. The TurboGrafx-16 and the CD component pushed the boundaries of video games, showing the industry what was indeed possible. Fully orchestrated audio and longer, more sophisticated cinematic cutscenes, things that eventually became standards in home video games, were taken to the next level with the TurboGrafx-16. Getting back to listener Paul from Connecticut, like many of us, he grew up in the Atari 2600 era before the NES and Sega took over the landscape. If you didn't catch one of the TurboGrafx-16 promotional tours or see the limited commercial spots on TV, you may have found out about the remarkable new system through a newspaper article. This is how Paul became aware of it when his local paper ran a story on how 16-bit games were the new up-and-coming thing. Fast forward to Christmas, where Paul made a deal with his parents, asking for a TurboGrafx-16, but no games and no other presents. As I mentioned, I didn't know anyone growing up who owned the system, but Paul shares some of his impressions from back then. He mentioned how impressed he was by the on-screen graphics and colors. He had games like Legendary Axe and Splatterhouse, the latter of which he believes still holds up today. The other thing that amazed him was renting the CD-ROM add-on and getting to play games at home that featured real music and voice acting. To Paul, it was the system that allowed more friends to play at once and was perfect during something like a birthday party. It also didn't seem like a toy, more of a grown-up console. And to him, the TurboGrafx-16 was a huge part of growing up, and he sees it as a system that bridged the gap between the 80s and the future of video games. There's been a lot of nostalgia for the TurboGrafx-16 in the last few years. Consoles, games, and old controllers can fetch a hefty price on places like eBay, as people are reliving the unique system that was quite ahead of its time. And as covered, some of those games still hold up well today. In 2020, Konami even released the TurboGrafx-16 Mini, a miniature version of the original console with nearly 60 built-in games that can connect to your modern TV with an HDMI cable. And it takes 2 controllers. The TurboGrafx-16, with its advanced technology and various add-ons, was the closest thing to having an advanced arcade game in your own home. Even though it was short-lived, the TurboGrafx-16 remains an important and influential footnote in the history of video games. So that's our show. Thank you so much for listening. If you're looking for topics related to this, I have a previous episode all about the history of the Nintendo Entertainment System, which is the perfect companion piece to this episode. I also have a show all about the legendary Super Mario Bros. 2. But besides those ones, there are previous episodes covering a wide variety of topics from the 80s. Movies, TV shows, cartoons, technology, and sports, there's a bit of everything for you. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the Everything 80s podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss out on new episodes. So thank you so much for taking this trip back in time with me today. I'm Jamie. This has been Everything 80s, but I'll be back soon with a new episode. Don't you dare miss it.